We often celebrate the grandeur of history, the glorious battles, the warble monuments, the moments where civilizations clash and heroes rise.
Right.
We talk about the Western narrative, starting with Thermopylae and Marathon, these great stands of Greek freedom. But today, we are taking a necessary detour, a shortcut to the history that was deliberately forgotten.
Mm.
The immense systemic costs that nobody on the triumphant side really wanted to acknowledge.
That's absolutely right. When most people think of the Persian Wars, the focus is so tightly set on names like Leonidas, Themistocles, and, the genius naval strategy at Salamis in 480 BCE.
The highlights.
Exactly. These are the bright spots, the historical moments that get polished and displayed in high definition. But those grand images, they necessarily conceal a shadow narrative.
And that's what we're here for.
One written not by celebratory Greek poets or historians like Herodotus, but by cold, meticulous accountants and bureaucrats, recording their work in cuneiform tablets.
Our mission today is focused entirely on that shadow. We're diving deep into the grim but fascinating aftermath of Xerxes I's failed invasion of Greece, specifically the period right after the decisive battle, so around 479 BCE.
A really critical moment.
And we are pulling from sources that were never, ever intended for public consumption: military logistical archives, private correspondence between Persian administrators, and those dry administrative tablets from the Achaemenid Empire.
Yeah.
And these sources reveal a conquest strategy far more insidious, or frankly, far more effective in the long run than simple military occupation. We're talking about systematic cultural erasure.
It's absolutely crucial to set the context here because the historical imbalance is just staggering. While Greek generals were being immortalized, while sculptors in Athens were maybe planning the Parthenon, there's an operation of what we can only describe as high-volume, industrial-scale logistics underway along the coastlines.
Industrial scale.
And we are forced to move past that single dismissive sentence Herodotus dedicated to Greek captives, a sentence that effectively buried this whole operation, and explore the detailed, calculated system designed not just to subjugate Greek culture, but to effectively, permanently consume it from the inside out.
Okay, let's unpack this. When we talk about conquest, we usually picture chaos, fire, a quick defeat. But what happens when that conquest transitions into something that looks less like a chaotic, bloody battle and more like an accounting audit,
Exactly.
complete with quotas, categories, and distribution chains? I mean, what were the sources of knowledge that brought this shadow operation to light?
That's the pivot. The sources are the key. For centuries, we relied solely on the Greek narrative. But in the 20th century, particularly through excavations in the Near East, places like Susa, but more importantly, specific administrative finds beneath the ruins of Pepilois and within the Persepolis fortification archive, we found the Persian side of the ledger.
The other side of the story.
And these weren't grand historical texts. They were ration lists, internal memos, transport manifests, and inventories. They documented movements of goods, taxes, and critically human inventory. That's where the true horror begins, in the organized banality of record keeping.
We have to start with the personal, with a story that was deliberately, relegated to the unrecorded reality of conquest. We need to ground this massive bureaucratic machine in a single devastating experience.
We do.
Let's set the scene. The year is 479 BCE.
Oof.
The Persian Wars are supposedly ending. The decisive battles are over. But the terror for the non-combatants is just beginning. We have an anecdote that surfaces in fragmented Persian private correspondence, a devastating glimpse into the capture process, referring to a young girl.
We can use the name Callista, based on references found in later Greek fragments of lament, although she likely wouldn't have answered to that name for long. The source material details her experience as a 12-year-old girl taken from a small coastal community called Boa.
And what's chilling is the focus, isn't it? It's not on the initial violent act of capture, but the subsequent logistical handling. She wasn't carried. She was dragged across the rocky landscape towards the coast.
The notes are meticulous about the logistics of suffering. Her ankles were bound with coarse hemp rope, designed not for comfort, but simply to restrict movement without requiring constant guard attention.
Right. It's about efficiency.
All about efficiency. The descriptions are focused on the inevitable friction, the physical cost of movement. Her feet became raw and shredded from the unrelenting contact with the jagged stones and sand.
And it's the contrast of sounds that makes this so terrible. Not the initial shock of battle, but the grinding sound of systemic violence.
Precisely. The surrounding environment wasn't chaos. Behind her, Persian soldiers moved in precise formations, not rushing or panicked. They moved with the certainty of men performing a known task. The sources emphasize that they have all the time in the world.
And ahead of her.
Ahead, sprawling across the beaches, was this massive tent city. Thousands of canvas structures, designated sectors, and orderly queues. The sounds coming from inside weren't the shouts of combat. They were the sounds of people being processed, the desperate realization that their world has ended while they're still breathing.
So it's the calculated sound of a life being dismantled, one administrative step at a time.
Exactly.
And this highlights the ultimate grotesque efficiency. The source describes how, after the village was secured, the soldiers organized the survivors by age and gender at the first light of dawn. This wasn't impulsive brutality.
Not at all.
This was done with the cold, practiced efficiency of men who had done this hundreds of times before.
It was logistical planning. The term used repeatedly in the Persian reports is nask. That translates roughly to inventory control. Conquest was operating at an industrial scale, and the primary objective wasn't pain, it was gathering high-value human resources for the administrative machine.
This brings us back to that monumental discrepancy in the historical record that we started with. We have this evidence of an organized industrial-scale event involving potentially tens of thousands of people, and yet Herodotus, the primary chronicler of these wars, he dedicated only one single sentence to the fate of these Greek captives.
It is the grand erasure, perfectly executed in text, one sentence. He wrote, "Many Greeks were taken, some were sold into servitude," and then he pivoted immediately back to discussing the brilliance of the trireme formations, the strategy at Plataea, and the elevation of Greek identity.
So he just moves on.
Completely. The focus was entirely on the men who died gloriously, thereby becoming heroes and martyrs. This narrative choice essentially made the existence and fate of tens of thousands of women and girls, the victims of slow, systemic cultural replacement, historically irrelevant.
The narrative of triumph requires a clean break, doesn't it? It's easier to carve a marble statue of a dying Spartan, a clear and immediate tragedy, than it is to acknowledge the systematic, complex, and slow process of cultural annihilation that was happening just down the coast.
Because that raises questions about the scope of the Greek victory itself.
Exactly. And that is why we must pivot entirely from the glorious narrative to the meticulous, dry, bureaucratic one. The sources tell us the actual fate of these people, estimated between 30,000 and 50,000 women and girls, was not recorded in monuments or plays.
No. It was documented in those Persian administrative tablets, cuneiform records found buried under structures in places like Pepololis, an administrative center used during the campaign.
And if we look closely at these records, we see that the Persians didn't just bring soldiers. The sources indicate that the invasion fleet included large complements of bureaucrats, professional scribes, logistical managers, and specifically, quote, slavers who weren't interested in killing everyone.
Because killing is inefficient, destruction is temporary, but assimilation is permanent.
They were interested in extraction then.
In sorting and turning living, thinking human beings into raw material for the perpetual machine of the Achaemenid Empire, the sources make it clear. Places like the Phaleron beaches, south of Athens, were not just staging grounds for military maneuvers. They were high-throughput processing centers or industrial facilities.
Wow.
They operated with precise manifests and tally sheets.
And the person overseeing this operation, whether it was the General Mardonius or a specific administrator referred to as Arbizos, the identity truly doesn't matter.
No, it doesn't.
What matters is the system he was managing, which operated with the precision and calculation of accountants at work.
And the language is the chilling signpost. The Persian term for this specific operation, the gathering of captives destined for assimilation, was baron. Now, in other contexts, baron literally means the taking of yield, or harvest time. Exactly. It's a term you would use when bundling grain or collecting tax revenues. Applying this term to human beings immediately signals that this wasn't impulsive wartime violence. It was a planned agricultural approach to population management. They were harvesting Greek people, categorizing them, and shipping them off for the long-term benefit of the Persian administrative structure.
That distinction is so critical. Achaemenid society already had forms of labor and slavery, but baron implies something else, a kind of systematic economic program attached to the captives. It views them as long-term assets, which is so different from the common Greek practice of simple prisoner ransoming or immediate chattel slavery.
It speaks to the organizational genius of the Persians. The Greeks might have used enslaved labor, but the Persian system was focused on integration. They weren't just acquiring temporary workers, they were acquiring potential administrators, wives, and mothers who would ensure the future loyalty of contested territories.
It was an investment calculation.
Absolutely. What will this human unit yield over a lifespan? That's the difference between chattel slavery and systematic cultural consumption.
So once these individuals arrived at the Phaleron processing centers, they stopped being individuals from Boa or Eritrea and became inventory for the barren operation.
That's right.
And the next part of the system kicks in immediately. Categorization and calculation. The policy of assimilation.
This is where the bureaucratic brilliance of the Achaemenid Empire is just laid bare. The survivors were brought in columns, sometimes walking for weeks, and immediately separated and categorized by the Persian scribes.
And the primary metric.
The primary and most consequential metric defining their future was age.
Okay, walk us through those three explicit categories. Because the administrative intent behind each destination, it reveals the cold, rational goal of the whole operation.
The system was structured rationally to maximize the empire's reproductive and cultural investment. So the first category, those under 12 years old.
The young.
They went to a sector designated for complete molding. They were considered young enough to have their Greek identity erased without significant resistance, essentially a blank slate, a tabula rasa upon arrival.
And the second group.
The second, and arguably most important category, were those aged 12 to 30, the women of prime childbearing age. They were sent to different sectors and received special attention, meaning intense indoctrination and preparation for reproductive service to the empire. This group was the designated vessel for the future generation of Persian loyalists.
And the third category, the older women.
Those over 30. They were deemed less valuable for assimilation and long-term reproduction, though still valuable for labor. They were immediately earmarked for the grueling labor camps, primarily located in Thrace, the colder, brutal northern territories recently subdued by Xerxes.
And their life expectancy.
The internal ledgers suggest that the expected life expectancy in those camps was indeed measured in seasons, not years, due to harsh working conditions and minimal provisioning.
So this categorization had nothing to do with their prior social standing, their intelligence, their loyalty to Greece, nothing.
It was purely about what demographic and reproductive value you represented to the empire.
Just a pure, cold, administrative calculation.
The younger women represented the future, and the older women represented temporary labor to support the ongoing military presence. This highly institutional, rational approach is what made the process so effective and, frankly, most dangerous. It wasn't driven by the temporary depraved passion of soldiers, but by a logistics decision made by bureaucrats reviewing efficiency reports.
And once they were categorized, they were absorbed into this vast administrative apparatus. This is where we encounter the heart of the assimilation network, what the sources call the haram.
That is a critical point of clarification. When many people hear the word haram today, they immediately think of later Islamic or Ottoman concepts of segregated royal palace quarters.
Right, the Sultan's harem.
But in the context of Xerxes' policy, the harem was a far broader term. It functioned as a massive, distributed assimilation network, the administrative apparatus designed specifically for cultural and physical transformation. It was, for all intents and purposes, a factory for new identities.
So the objective wasn't simple physical containment in a palace. It was a complex system extending across the satrapies, the Persian provinces. How did the network coordinate the movement of thousands of women across the vastness of the Persian Empire?
The satrapy system was their logistical masterstroke. Once categorized, these groups were moved quickly along the royal road network, utilizing Persian infrastructure that connected Sardes to Susa. The administrative tablets confirm the allocation of these captives as gifts or assignments to powerful regional governors or satraps in territories far removed from Greece, Lydia, Cappadocia, even deep into Mesopotamia.
So they're scattered.
Immediately. This geographical separation ensured that any hope of return or organized rescue was nullified. They were parceled out as political and demographic investments.
The ultimate objective, then, was profound: to take Greek women and transform them into Persian subjects, mothers of Persian children, ensuring they became the cultural glue binding the next generation of Persian administrators to the empire. It's systematic, State-sponsored demographic warfare.
It was the definition of bureaucratic colonialism.
Hmm.
The power they exercised wasn't just to occupy land temporarily, but to fundamentally rewrite the very bloodlines that would inherit that land. The conquest was designed to be internalized.
To understand how identity itself was rewritten, which is the most chilling aspect of this, we can rely on the case study of a girl named Sophia. We know her name only because of a fragment, a small pottery shard found in Eritrea, detailing a specific lament.
And corresponding fragments in the Persepolis tablets referencing a shipment of young women to the satrapy of Sardis. She was 14 when taken.
Just 14.
And Sophia represents the ideal success case for the assimilation system. She was taken not because she had specific skills, but because she was young enough to learn, young enough to be molded, and critically, young enough that her entire sense of self could be rewritten before she reached full adulthood.
So the system understood that trauma, if followed by total cultural immersion, could erase native memory far faster than physical punishment.
Absolutely.
The sources outline a systematic 5-step process designed to eliminate Greek memory entirely. Let's detail this methodical erasure.
The steps are chilling in their meticulousness and coordination. First, permanent separation. They were immediately separated from their mothers and any familial figures, ensuring the primary source of cultural knowledge, history, and language was removed.
And they do that by sending them to different places, right?
Exactly. Mothers to the labor camps in Thrace, daughters to the administrative centers in Sardis.
Okay, step 2.
Linguistic imposition. They were intensively taught Persian, Old Persian, or Elamite, depending on the destination, and simultaneously discouraged, often brutally, from speaking Greek. The goal was to make the memory of their mother tongue strange and distant, like forgetting a dream or a melody.
They're the names.
Step 3, nominal destruction. Their Greek birth names were erased and immediately replaced with Persian names. Sophia might become Anahit or Esther, a profound act of identity destruction, transforming the individual into property of the state.
And they were surrounded by the culture.
That's step 4, total immersion. They were surrounded entirely by Persian culture. Persian servants who reinforced the language, Persian stories and mythology. So, Ahura Mazda replacing the Olympian gods, Persian clothing, Persian cuisine. This total immersion was the mechanism of the Haram. It prevented any residual Greek identity from surviving.
And finally,
Reproductive assignment. They were encouraged, facilitated, or forced to bear children specifically assigned to serve the empire's needs. This made them, effectively, incubators for the next generation of loyal Persian administrators.
the ultimate goal was not just to make them silent subjects, but to make them mothers of completely loyal Persians. This is long-term demographic engineering.
Absolutely. The system played the long game. The children born into this meticulously managed environment would grow up speaking Persian as their first and only language. They would have, at best, a vague sense that their mother had once known something called Greek, a language that would seem impossible, or a past that seemed unreal, like a fantastical bedtime story.
And the sources say that by the second generation, the conquest was so complete
That it would be effectively invisible to the descendants themselves.
If the first two parts explain the logistical structure and the systematic process, then this next part, it has to focus on the geopolitical outcome, the conquest of the future.
That's it. The ultimate triumph for Xerxes wasn't just winning a battle, it was ensuring that those mixed-blood descendants would become the next generation of the Persian administrative and military elite.
So those children would grow up completely integrated. They would govern territories their mothers once called home. They would serve an empire their mothers had been taken to resist.
They'd be fully, completely Persian, potentially looking back at their Greek maternal heritage with confusion or even contempt.
This invisible conquest is terrifying, because it means the victim aids the conqueror without even realizing it.
It is the silent victory. The source material notes that this outcome made the conquest so complete that it transcended military defeat. Even after the Greeks drove the Persian military presence out of the Aegean, the genetic and administrative seeds of Persia were already deeply planted across the Mediterranean rim, loyal to Susa.
We have to consider the scale here, because while other empires used similar strategies, the Romans, the Ottomans, the Spanish, the sources suggest that Xerxes' system was unique because of the sheer volume and institutional efficiency of the Achaemenid bureaucracy.
That's the Achaemenid difference. We're talking about an estimated 30,000 to 50,000 Greek women and girls absorbed into the Persia system over a very short period. This wasn't local kidnapping, this was state policy.
And they were just distributed.
Rapidly distributed. They were invested in religious temples as sacred slaves, gifted to Median and Persian nobility to cement loyalty, or absolved directly into the administrative and military apparatus across the satrapies.
Even if we accept the lowest estimates, say 15,000 to 25,000.
It still represents a demographic catastrophe for the Greek world, particularly for city-states already struggling with population constraints after decades of war.
It's a wholesale, systematic removal of Greek identity and reproductive potential. And crucially, you're saying this policy wasn't primarily about temporary labor or immediate economic gain.
Not at all. The policy was fundamentally about replacement. It was a demographic strategy masquerading as a logistics problem.
So the motive was deeper than profit. It was about replacing a people with a new people that looked like them but thought like Persians. Why would Xerxes' administration prioritize replacement over simple slaughter or, high-value ransom?
The conqueror's insight here is dark, but it's historically validated. If you slaughter a people, you create martyrs and inspire perpetual resistance fueled by the need for revenge.
Right.
But if you take their daughters, assimilate them, and raise their grandsons as yours, you dissolve the memory of defeat. You ensure that the next generation never remembers there was another homeland. You win in a way that looks like natural population evolution, not conquest.
And the success of this long-term strategy is revealed in the records within just 2 generations. We have Persian administrative documents suggesting that descendants of these assimilated captives were serving in high-level roles.
Indeed. We find records of individuals with distinctly Greek maternal lineages, often hinted at by naming conventions, serving in Persian courts as scribes, becoming governors or hyparchs, or even military leaders.
Military leaders.
There are documented instances of these mixed blood commanders leading troops against Greek resistance movements in Ionia or Anatolia.
It is the ultimate perfect erasure. They were fighting their own maternal heritage without any memory of their origins, convinced they were serving the interests of a foreign power because that power had given them their identity.
The Greek element remained in the blood, certainly, but the identity, the language, the culture, the fundamental sense of belonging had been completely replaced. They were Persian, thoroughly and completely, thanks to the cold efficiency of the barren system.
But not every story ends in seamless, successful integration. Some women manage to return, and their fate reveals the final, devastating layer of this systematic erasure. We have the poignant story of Harmonia.
Harmonia's story is heartbreaking because she survived the Persian system only to be destroyed by the Greek one. She returned to Eritrea around 460 BCE, perhaps a dozen years after her initial capture, having been held in a facility in Susa or Sardis.
So she was about 28, a grown woman, but she carried the physical evidence of her captivity.
She did. She had a son with her, a boy maybe 6 years old, half Persian, whom she had born and nursed while learning Persian songs. She returns home, having survived the unspeakable, and Greece does not welcome her back.
No.
The rejection was institutional. Eritrean and, more broadly, Athenian societal norms, especially following the intensification of citizenship laws like those later imposed by Pericles, viewed her as fundamentally tainted. The city records described her explicitly as contaminated by barbarian touch.
And that designation meant she couldn't re-enter civic life.
Correct.
So how extensive was this social destruction? Was this just moral judgment, or were there legal components to her exclusion?
It was legal and social erasure combined. Her family refused to take her in. They viewed her existence as a source of shame and a taint on the family line. Legally, the city refused to recognize her citizenship or that of her son.
Which made her...
What? It made her effectively a metoikos, a resident alien without protection, and a highly undesirable one at that. She was explicitly banned from purchasing property, marrying a Greek citizen, or participating in civic life. The very pillars of a recognized existence were denied to her.
So the ultimate invisible victory of Xerxes' bureaucracy, then, was this double violation.
Precisely. The Persians won once by taking her, violating her body and identity, and they won a second time by ensuring that when she returned, Greece itself rejected her, making her disappearance into the countryside or the shadows of the city inevitable. Her return only solidified her social and historical erasure.
She had nowhere left to belong.
Nowhere.
So as Athens flourished, as democracy was perfected, as the great philosophers, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, began shaping Western thought,
Yeah.
all of this profound intellectual and artistic development was happening while thousands of Greek women were systematically removed from Greek existence,
Yeah.
both physically and socially.
It's the definition of historical selective memory. It speaks to the uncomfortable truth that flourishing often requires a convenient forgetfulness. The women became, at best, a necessary but uncomfortable footnote. The historian Theope wrote about them only once, in passing, calling them the silent women, Greek survivors who lived perpetually on the margins, unable to integrate, unable to articulate their suffering in a society that only wanted to hear about victory.
Theoph's description is profoundly haunting. He wrote that they are like shadows. They move through the agora, but no one sees them. They were living ghosts. They were allowed to exist physically in their home cities, moving through the marketplace, but they were not of those cities anymore. They were erased from social space.
And this is the essence of historical injustice. They were victims of a conquest that Greece desperately wanted to forget because acknowledging it meant acknowledging the limits of their military victory and the deep, persistent stain of cultural contamination. They were silenced while still breathing, their suffering considered too shameful, too great a challenge to the triumphant narrative.
But the silence created by political necessity rarely lasts forever. History has a way of leaving physical evidence that contradicts the convenient political narratives. This is where archaeology steps in, giving these silent women a voice that history tried to suppress.
This is where the physical evidence confronts the political narrative head-on. Archaeologists working in regions that saw heavy Persian occupation by Awasha, sections of Attica, and specific burial sites on the islands have uncovered burial sites from the mid-5th century BCE.
And what did they find?
These sites contain women's remains with specific, unusual physical characteristics consistent with systematic deprivation and captivity. These are truly the graves that refuse to lie.
How does forensic archaeology confirm a life of systematic suffering consistent with long-term captivity, rather than, say, poverty or localized disease? What specific scientific markers did they find?
It requires some pretty advanced techniques. Firstly, you've got stable isotope analysis of teeth and bone, which confirms they were often non-local to where they died, or their diet changed drastically at certain points in their short lives. Secondly, the physical evidence is clear. We see classic signs of long-term, severe malnutrition and chronic stress. Critically, we find severe skeletal trauma consistent with repeated, non-fatal violence-healed fractures of ribs and arms.
And the most compelling evidence related to their systematic use within the Barren system.
That evidence lies in the spine and the pelvis. We see chronic joint problems suggesting heavy, repetitive physical labor beyond normal expectations for women in that era, and in many cases, compression fractures in the vertebrae, what forensic anthropologists refer to as Schmorl's nodes.
Which indicates what?
Long-term, extreme weight-bearing or severe physical trauma to the spine. But perhaps most devastatingly, we find pelvises scarred by repeated early pregnancies, often starting before the body was fully developed. This is the physical testimony of years of systematic abuse and deprivation under a policy designed for a rapid, maximum reproductive yield.
The source gives us that single devastating example. The skeleton found near ancient Thebes, which serves as a potent physical metaphor for the entire operation.
Yes, this woman was likely only 23 or 24 when she died. Her remains showed the trauma of at least 3 full-term pregnancies in rapid succession. She had compression fractures in her spine, consistent with heavy labor performed during or immediately following pregnancy, and a pelvis severely deformed by multiple childbirths at an age when her body wasn't ready.
And the consensus is she died in childbirth.
A common fate for those subjected to such harsh reproductive conditions without proper care in the Persian administrative centers.
And beside her remains, a final, heartbreaking act of defiance against the entire system of erasure, the discovery of the clay tablet.
This is the ultimate, final testimony and perhaps the most powerful historical artifact of this entire period. Archaeologists found a small, carefully inscribed clay tablet beside her. It was scratched into the clay with a sharp stone, painstakingly, in a local Greek dialect.
A message.
A careful, desperate, and singular assertion of existence against the bureaucracy of annihilation.
And the heartbreaking inscription reads, "I am daughter of no one. I am mother of no one. I am the forgotten."
That inscription encapsulates everything we've discussed. It's a defiant refusal to accept the nominal destruction imposed by the Persian system and the social erasure imposed by the Greek system.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The mechanism of erasure was so perfect, so complete, that it required this individual woman, 2,500 years ago, to leave a carved note asserting her refusal to be forgotten.
She left this tiny, painful note for a future that might eventually listen. The cold administrative oversight, the system designed to make her disappear, failed in the very last moment.
She left her testimony against the annihilation wearing the mask of administrative efficiency.
It's proof that even when absorbed, renamed, silenced, and rejected, the human spirit fought back just enough to leave a small, indelible mark on the archaeological record. They knew silence was the final death, and she ensured that her specific, terrible experience would not vanish entirely into the triumph of the Greek narrative.
We began this deep dive by celebrating the grandeur of history, but we found ourselves immersed in the cold, calculated efficiency of cultural erasure. The logistics of the barren system and the systematic replacement of Greek identity managed through the administrative haram.
What we have seen is that the historical record often focuses only on visible violence, the immediate suffering and chaos of war. But the deepest, most permanent erasure is invisibility, the complete negation of existence achieved by systematic, methodical integration.
So the real victory for the Persians wasn't the conquest of territory, which they failed to hold.
No, it was the conquest of identity itself.
So what does this all mean? It means that the stories of the erased often reveal far more about how power operates than the stories of the celebrated conquerors. They matter because they show us how systems can consume people without them ever realizing they were consumed, and how identity can be replaced so thoroughly that the descendants become agents of the conquering power.
And it forces us to acknowledge that history is often written explicitly in favor of those who survived, to tell the glorious tale, leaving the victims of systematic, quiet administrative processes relegated to a single, easily ignored footnote, a practice that ensures the narrative remains clean and palatable. The silence surrounding these tens of thousands of women is the ultimate measure of Xerxes' bureaucratic victory.
The system Xerxes utilized, the quiet, methodical cultural replacement, where the line between conqueror and conquered blurred entirely, where the goal was to plant seeds rather than occupy land, it didn't stop when the Persian Wars ended. It is a historical blueprint for how to defeat a people permanently, not through rapid violence, but through generational administrative oversight.
And that leads to our final provocative thought for you to mull over. We have spent this time analyzing the mechanics of barren, the systematic taking of yield, as applied to human identity 2,500 years ago.
So the question is this: what modern systems or processes today operate with such cold, quiet, bureaucratic efficiency, ensuring that one group's history, language, or identity is quietly absorbed, footnoted, or functionally erased, while the world celebrates a different, grander, more immediate narrative?
Think about how quiet erasure operates today, and what evidence might be left behind for future archaeologists to find 2,500 years from now.